Greetings and salutations. My name is Anthony Dominguez and I will be presenting on the anti-globalization movement. Why an anti-globalization movement? Well, this anti-globalization movement is much more contemporary than the other movements such as environmentalism and the women's rights movement because it really only comes in the aftermath of World War II and the development of international financial institutions and that grand trade liberalization. And so it was really the expansion of these multinational financial institutions and multinational corporations that ignited this anti-globalization movement when people started to realize that there was this growing wealth disparity. And here I have a quote from a law review paper from the University of Miami. Between 1960 and 1980, average per capita growth in all countries of the world grew 83%, while in the globalized era, 1980 through 2000, it fell to 33%. Now, of course, this has a lot to do with, domestic civil unrest and all sorts of other elements, but globalization is really a key factor in analyzing what went wrong in this time period. And so many working class coalitions came together to criticize, and still do come together to criticize, globalization's neoliberal policies of deregulated trade globalizations for its commercialization of the world. And the biggest con of this commercialization is that it puts profits over people. Oh, that's a really good slogan. It puts a really horrible slogan, but a really good slogan to criticize this. It really puts profits over people, as we see that it disadvantages the workers in weaker countries through these seemingly win-lose, non-zero-sum economic interactions. And so I'll kind of explain that in this case study that I researched. But before we get to that, I kind of just want to explain what are these policies of globalization that people are against. Like, what are these neoliberal policies? So at the Washington Consensus, or the Washington Consensus of 1989, is really this prescriptive list of 10 items that economist John Williamson kind of curated when looking at Latin American politics and Latin American domestic macroeconomic policies in the 1980s. And so these are the policies that the governments were kind of adopting and implementing to kind of, get back on their feet and build their economies. So number one, reduce national budget deficits by raising taxes or cutting spending, right? So the main goal of these policies in the end are to decrease national debt and to increase economic growth. Number two, redirect spending to build underdeveloped economic sectors and infrastructure. So this one is more about promoting the social welfare in the country, promoting education infrastructure, promoting healthcare infrastructure, and making sure that the spending and the revenue that we have coming into the government is really being distributed in a fair way that will promote social welfare. Number three, implementing efficient tax collection / simplifying taxes. Again, they want to make sure that they're collecting the revenue aptly. Number four, liberalizing the financial sector towards market-determined interest rates. So this is about decreasing the central government's control of the economy and kind of allowing private businesses to thrive through this growing privatization. Number five, adopt a competitive single exchange rate to promote export-led growth. Number six, reduce trade restrictions. So that includes things like tariffs, things like quotas. Number seven, abolish barriers to foreign direct investment. Number eight, privatize state-owned enterprises to increase national productivity and growth. Number nine, abolish policies that restrict competition / implement deregulation policies. And number 10, provide secure, affordable property to expand the economy and the government's tax revenue. And so this set of policies was seen as being very, very effective at building a nation's economy and lowering its overall debt. And so institutions like the IMF, the World Bank, and the United States Department of the Treasury began implementing these policy reforms into their standard package when dealing with debt relief packages. And so we see that a lot of countries in Latin America and especially in Africa have taken out these debt relief loans to start up their economies under conditionalities that include policies 1 through 10, which is essentially what people have pointed towards as these neoliberal policies. So overall, just general government deregulation and the increase of foreign investment and so on and so on. And so now we see a case study on the failure of Bretton Woods institutions in sub-Saharan Africa. And so what I'm doing here is just providing the context for the fervor that people of the anti-globalization movement feel. And this is all just in the economic side. I'll get into some of the other elements that also play into it. So when we look at sub-Saharan Africa, we see that in the 1980s there was a decline in export revenue, mainly due to the collapse of world prices of agricultural commodities, which was the main export, about 88% of sub-Saharan Africa's exports, and the reduction of the price of oil. And so due to this fallout, governments were turning to international financial institutions for debt relief, and they had to adopt these policies that were instituted through the conditionalities of their packages. So these neoliberal policies included things like removing agricultural subsidies and tariffs and privatizing publicly owned firms. Again, this was to guarantee that they would be able to pay back their debt relief loans. And so what we really see is that there were many consequences. And you can see here in this little timeline, 1960, mainly we're focusing 1960 through 2000, there was this growth in the first 20 years, which very soon dipped in the 1980s. And 1960s is when countries started becoming politically independent, these former colonies. And so through the 1960s and the 80s, there was growing confidence in business expectations, and also the governments and the economies were just building themselves, so it was looking very promising. And then we see this dip in the 80s, partially due to this growing debt that countries faced and the growing cycle of debt that they entered when incorporating these IFI debt relief plans. And so what inevitably occurred was the undermining of the role of local ownership in shaping domestic economic policy, reduced spending on social welfare programs, which again was initially what this Washington Consensus outlined, right? The improvement of economic sectors and of underdeveloped economic sectors and infrastructure, right? It wasn't just to make the wealthy wealthier. It was to make sure that there would be a stable economy where all people could thrive. But we see that there was a major failure of that here. Another consequence was the removal of agricultural subsidies actually made it difficult for farmers to compete in international markets, because when you have American farmers being subsidized to grow their crops, they're going to be able to sell those crops at a cheaper price, which makes their product much more attractive to consumers, to foreign consumers, than the products in Africa, which will be sold at a relatively higher price. You saw increased unemployment, and you saw this race to the bottom mentality for labor standards when foreign businesses came in and invested and developed factories for employees in the sub-Saharan African region. So overall, a decrease in the quality of life aspect to it, and also the decrease of economic growth, as you can see here. So now we get to the anti-globalization demonstrations and protests. I want to highlight one of the major ones here in the US and then one of the major ones over in Europe. So the Carnival Against Capitalism. I'm sorry, this one is the European one. This will be the American one. The Carnival Against Capitalism, J18th, which symbolizes June 18th, 1989, when this kind of riot-ish demonstration occurred. It occurred in London. It was people basically storming towards the London International Financial Futures Exchange, where people were basically, fighting against the system and the policies that it had implemented and the growing disparity which it contributed to. So thousands of people converged and were distributing masks, carrying out several marches towards the exchange. And this event coincided with the 25th G8 summit, just to emphasize people's campaign against this global regime of trade. And so the text in the masks that people were handing out read, "Disregarding borders, the power of money humiliates dignities, insults honesties, and assassinates hope." And this riot, here's a cartoon from back in the day. It really paints the people as, crazy revolutionists. Gosh, money's uncool. Capitalists are so naughty. Really just making fun of them. And it got a little violent, but it really sent the message out there, and it set the precedent for future large-scale anti-globalization protests. And I include here that the protests also included many organizations, including the Campaign Against Arms Trade. And so it was really all these groups and coalitions coming together to kind of show their resistance to this ongoing development and the ongoing growth of globalization. In the US, this was a really big one. The Seattle World Trade Organization protests of 1999. So this was people directly protesting a WTO ministerial conference, and it lasted just a few days while the conference was going on. And it included labor unions such as the American Federal Labor Union, student groups, NGOs, international workers. It was really an international effort, just like this one, might I add. Both of these, the anti-globalization movement really works in this global network. It isn't really a European-centered one or an American-centered one. You really see that it's got reach all across the country, and this one, all across the world, excuse me, and this one really demonstrates that, as this was the first internet plan demonstration or protest of the anti-globalization movement. So you actually had 400,000 participants in a virtual sit-in to demonstrate the resistance to globalization and to institutions like the World Trade Organization. And you had an insane amount of in-person physical protesters. You had 40 to 50,000 protesters on the streets fighting back, and the police inevitably got involved. And people were carrying out civil disobedience to oppose the WTO policies, free trade, and the human rights failures of globalization. In fact, the movement the day of was so large that they were able to successfully prevent the opening ceremony of the ministerial conference from taking place. And the effects of this were basically as I said, the suspension of the conference towards the end, but it also put the movement in the spotlight, especially now with the internet. It really took to using this international outreach through internet-based platforms to grow the spread of the anti-globalization movement. And so this is a movement that really encompasses all kinds of things. It's for environmentalism, it's for human rights, it's for economic growth. All these sorts of things kind of piled into one. So, like I said, it's not an American-centered movement, it's not a European-centered movement, it's really a global movement against globalization. And now I want to turn and look at it from a more political and socioeconomic context in the US. With the success of populist nationalist parties in Europe and the US, we have seen the growth of anti-globalization in domestic policies. These policies are motivated by conservative perspectives on immigration, trade, and cultural exchange. So we saw with the Trump administration that there was a lot of reversal of global integration of America. There were increases in trade tariffs, such as the initiation of this trade war against China and the implementation of these tariffs. Many anti-immigration border restrictions, which is more on the cultural, social aspect of it, right? The nativist mindset really took ground in this era, and within that context, anti-globalization increased. We saw the withdrawal from the Paris Climate Agreement, which again is not just an environmental adjacent event, but it also has to do with economic development, right? Because the Paris Climate Agreement would limit production of goods based on the resources that are used. You saw the withdrawal from the UN Human Rights Council, and you saw withdrawal from the Trans-Pacific Partnership. And Trump really uses America First rhetoric, again, kind of symbolizing this more individualistic, domestic, nativist approach to policy. And then in the United Kingdom, we had Brexit, which was kind of spearheaded by populist Prime Minister Mr. Cameron, who ran on this "Take Back Control" slogan. And so that really mobilized voters to support him and to support this Brexit movement. And even though it was just a slight marginal majority, UK eventually ended up leaving the EU. And this demonstrated the economic protectionism and the anti-immigration sentiments that exist in the European political world, and it was mainly the rural areas that voted for this support. So, it makes more sense when you kind of see the correlation between the right wing in the US and over in the UK. It's really the right wing which is pro anti-globalization. And so that is all I have for the presentation. I see it's running 17 minutes and 47 seconds. It's more than 5 minutes. I hope I can upload this, but I hope you all enjoyed and you took away something new and salient from my presentation. Thank you.